So Reed, you're our oldest member of the comics team here at Going Twice. Not in age, but just in hours and blood, sweat, and tears put into the job. And you also happen to be quite knowledgeable about a lot of sort of the beginnings of comics, right? I just sort of wanted to get your thoughts on sort of, so how did the sort of the superhero come to be in the 30s and 40s, and sort of what did the beginning of comic books look like? Because, of course, I imagine the beginning was more entertainment than collecting.
Yeah, so for about 20 years, collecting didn't really start until about the early 1960s, because early comics, like, they came from pulp novels. Like, early Batman was just the pulp character, the Shadow. So a lot of the origins of early comics, they were also propaganda in terms of, like, Captain America punching Hitler. That's Captain America Comics #1. But, when it comes to comics, for about 20 years, like, they sort of have this, again, the similar standing to pulp novels and pulp stories like that, to where there wasn't really like a legitimate recognition for it. They were just sort of like, it was like, yeah, this is what people got. Mostly it was for kids. There were some incredibly popular titles that were even more popular than Superman, like with the original Captain Marvels from Fawcett City. But
okay.
Yeah, so in 1960, with the Silver Age, that's what we call it, the Silver Age, that was when things sort of like, there weren't a lot, but comic book stores did exist. But up until then, they weren't a thing at all. Comics would be, there'd be direct order, there would be things that, like, you could just pick up from your local store, there would be things that you would get, like, to support the war effort. But yeah, but for the first 20 years or so, it was really figuring things out. It was finding out what worked and a lot of what didn't. And basically, for that time, like, they were just sort of doing pulp, and for a better explanation, pulp novels. They were very much like your ideas of whenever you've seen like a strong shirtless man wrestling wild animals like a panther and an anaconda. It was those sort of things. But yeah, early comics were
hyper masculine. Yeah.
Early comics very much an adaptation of that. I'm also noticing the ring is perfectly in my eyes, so this just looks kind of terrifying right now, which is delightful.
Great. Yeah, you look like a supervillain. It's fantastic. Yeah. And so the early comic books. I mean, so I know there had been versions of comics even in like 1901, 1900.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like early versions. But it really was the 30s and 40s where we see it really kick off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sort of so you've got, like you said, very useful propaganda tool, very, very easy way to sort of tell a narrative that you want to propagate, without being super direct. I mean, I guess literally punching Hitler. I mean, it's hard to get much more direct than that. But that is interesting. So characters like, Wolverine, when did Wolverine first, because he's obviously one of the most recognizable these days and one of the most popular. When did Wolverine get his start?
Wolverine was in Hulk 181, which was in the I think it was 181. Give me a sec. I have to check my own numbers because I don't know off the top of my head. But Wolverine, when he first showed up, was not the character that we recognize right now. It wasn't until he was properly brought up in Giant Size X-Men #1, which was, so the original X-Men books actually sort of got canceled, basically. Like, after about, I think it was issue 60, the original X-Men Silver Age, after about issue 60, they actually went ahead and went into reprints. So for about 30 issues, that book, X-Men, they were just doing reprints. They were just doing the original stories, but with different covers. And it wasn't until Giant Size X-Men #1, which was, again, launched under Len Wein, launched using a bunch of characters that sort of existed around the time. But that was where we first got Storm, where we first got Cyclops, where Wolverine really came into himself. This was 1974.
1974. Got it. So much later.
Yeah. Way later. Because again, like, the original X-Men books, like, again, they're not forgotten these days because obviously people are very aware of them. But the Silver Age run is not like up there with some of the greats like Spider-Man or Fantastic Four, just in terms of, again, it's so fascinating that, yeah, no, like it went into reprints. That didn't happen to any of the other books. They would have like Marvel's Greatest Comics, or you would have later reprints like Marvel Tales. But no, this was like X-Men 66 would be a reprint of X-Men #2.
Sure. So, because it was interesting for me looking at the sort of the earlier comics, especially around World War II, and just knowing sort of, right, because after World War II, we see the start of the CIA, right? And the idea of creating this super soldier with all sorts of different mind tests and things like that, that I feel like came from comic books. And in a way, you know, Alan Dulles is like, but what if we could do that? And you see, like, in some of what they tried to do afterwards, it almost feels like they were trying to recreate moments in comic books with like how they were like, but what if we could mind control a super soldier? And, you know, what if we could really like actually do this? And it is just so fascinating to me, sort of seeing how comic books really, in a, you know, I don't feel like any of those men would admit that they, you know, took a comic book seriously, but I feel like, you know, that's sort of where these ideas began, right? Like the idea of space travel certainly came from science fiction. You know, it's just super interesting to see. But sort of going back to the collecting side, you know, I guess the reason I wanted to sort of talk about comics in particular is because sort of what I'm trying to trace is, right, like how do we go from photos of Civil War generals to Pikachu, right? Like they're related, but it's a very long sort of evolution between having this photo of a real person who is alive while I'm alive, but I only get to relate to him via this photo, right? Like I don't know this guy, but I can own his picture now. To fast forward, now I can have a Pikachu that I see on TV and doesn't actually exist, but I still can somehow have a relationship to it through this card. And I feel like comic books is sort of that middle ground where you really can get to know these people, right, through, I mean, series and series and series, and obviously there's different universes and different storylines, and sometimes, you know, a character winds up dead in one storyline, you know, but just sort of I'm interested to hear your take on sort of like, because I feel like there are collectors, right, who go after a particular character, right? There's somebody that they really do like collecting, somebody that they find something inside them connects with.
One of the things that I know you guys have talked about a lot is, and this sort of comes to the casual level, the idea that no one really plays Pokemon outside of like the high level play.
Right.
Which is sort of there's like championships, but it's not like people coming in the stores to play them as much as they would play locals with Magic or even Yu-Gi-Oh! Or something like that. And with comics, it's really interesting because you have like such a disparity where you would almost say like it depends on the person, it depends on the collector, but the higher up you get, it's kind of like it becomes more similar to collecting in other fields like cards, where like the higher up you get, the less likely you are to have the time to actually read or enjoy the stories from anything that you're following. But at the same time, you have people who are like, yeah, I'm going to spend $100,000 in a Wolverine collection because I know everything the characters showed up in. But you also have people who are like, no, I'm just going to get a bunch of single raw issues of this, but I still know this as much as I know anything else. Like I have some friends of mine who like have the most rapid recall you ever could for comics, but they don't have particularly huge collections. But that's what makes it really interesting with comics compared to anything else. The fact that, like, there are stories, like you could say so with sports, like there's real life people, but that's different from like comics where like there's a universe. But again, sort of similar with Pokemon, the higher up you get, the less people are sort of collecting it for the stories, because you're not getting it to read it, because you can read comics anywhere. You can read a comic online. You're getting it to have, but in many ways, then it is more similar to sports, because it's a piece of the history, sort of, if that appeals to you. Right. And with me, what it is with collecting, it's like if there'd be something I would want, it'd be like a book that, maybe it costs like up to $1,000, but it's like, that's just because I want to have it. It's not because I want to read it. I could read it anywhere, but it's, it's the same day. It represents having a part of the history. And that's what's interesting to me, that with sports, I get it. With Pokemon, it's like, yeah, this hollow foil doesn't necessarily represent a piece in history. It just represents a piece in rarity, even compared to like sports, where you could be like, oh, this represents when someone was still a rookie, where they were at earlier. Well, it's interesting. I think that's where sports and comics have that, like that represents a piece of history, where Pokemon not as much. Sure. Especially due to Pokemon largely popping up 3 years ago in 2020 in terms of the current market.
Yeah. I mean, there was definitely like, you know, your diehard vintage collectors who will try to pick up sort of like those limited release promos, which would be the closest thing to getting that rookie card, where it's like, hey, this card was released on a Japanese airline for 1 month in 1998. And so it's like, it is sort of that like, oh, but you're really going to pay a premium for that. But no, I completely understand. I mean, comics too has such a long history. I mean, aside from sports cards, probably the longest history of sort of like, I mean, if we're talking Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, you know, all these were new. These are all very new in comparison. Comic books have been around for forever. I think, you know, baseball cards first started popping up in tobacco in like 1870s or so. Yeah. And only 30, you know, about probably 20 years later, you're starting to see, you know, the first comics begin to appear. I am sort of just fascinated with the idea of, I mean, these just getting so invested in a world outside of our own, you know, and I think that's why that is actually where I see the similarity between Pokemon and comics for the real diehard Pokemon fans, not the ones who are buying it to flip it or make money, but the ones who like really grew up with it and like got super invested in the games and watched the show and like had the whole thing. I don't think that, you know, culturally that exists without comics coming first and like really starting to allow you to think that way. You know what I mean? Like to get lost and to allow your mind to wander into a world that doesn't necessarily exist tangibly in the world around you.
Yeah, that's fiction in general. That's going to like, what do human beings do with their time to entertain themselves? And I agree with that. But yeah, that's fiction. That's movies. That's video games. That's television shows. That's like going back to seeing plays in the stadiums, seeing Shakespeare back in the day. But yeah, no, they're and again, it's so interesting to me because like with sports and with comics, you can sort of point and, you know, someone go, you can like, oh, why is this worth $500? And you can say rarity, but you can also say like, oh, yeah, it's because it's fundamentally important. It's a first appearance. It had like a key artist working on the character for the first time. Compared to me, someone who doesn't know Pokemon as much, I can be like, if a Pokemon card is $500, it is because it is rare.
Right.
I'm sure there's exceptions to that, but I'd say, there's much more
for the most part.
That are like, because there's not, compared to the importance, especially in more modern stuff, but that's the same thing with comics. Like anything with comics recent, it's like, it's because it's rare, because it's at a low print run. Yeah,
very, very few Pokemon cards are very expensive because of their historical significance. Yeah. It is much more based around rarity. And just overall demand for that character, right? Like Charizard's going to cost more than, you know, a Togepi, whatever. Yeah. So it is interesting too. I feel like because, like you said, first appearances, different artists, almost by accident, they made their own first editions. You know, it is something that you can trace back and be like, all right, this is the first time this person showed up. It's not like when they made that comic for the intention of it being this landmark, but then it turns into it as the hobby of collecting sort of picks up.
Well, it'll be interesting because at certain time, it's interesting because you have stuff like the sensational character find of 1939 when Robin first shows up. They're actually like, they would celebrate it, and that's what makes it interesting because like in that universe they would be like, oh no, here it comes, this is the first time this character's here, this is a big deal. And that was usually more in the early days. But again, it's so interesting, especially since, again, similar to Pokemon having an origin point in 2020 or whatever. Yeah, if we didn't have the MCU, comic collecting would be dramatically different because it existed before the MCU, but it would not be nearly what it is
today
without it. There, it would be fascinating to see, because there would definitely be strong facets of it. Because like, as anything gets older, it is going to get more valuable in a way, because it's harder to find. But yeah, it'd be very interesting to be like, what's like Amazing Fantasy 15, the first appearance of Spider-Man, what's that running without all the hype of the MCU and all the people collecting that? But it's interesting to say.
Yeah, no,
it's
absolutely.
Like how much it was like because of like 2008. And again, and that's the market. That's why the market is Marvel. There is some DC, but that's why the large majority is Marvel. Got it.
No, that makes sense. Well, thank you so much for jumping on, Reed. I do really appreciate it, being part of this series. This is sort of the podcast is a little light and loose. This is sort of where I love to be able to just dig in and really just, have you educate us, tell us about sort of, how all these, how we got here, why are we here, in terms of like comic collecting and things like that, because I think, in terms of the history of collecting, comics are essential, arguably the only thing that rivals sports cards.
Yeah.
And I think
it's been around that long.
It's been around that long, and there's just more. It's just like you said, historical significance. I mean, it tells the story of the political climate at the time.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Sort of a way of capturing culture in the moment, as in a snapshot. But it's a whole
because comics like all art are political. They've always been political. Superman in his first issue shows up, he beats up a wife beater. He's the champion of the oppressed. You have the entire like base of the X-Men, which is they live in a world that hates and fears them. But yeah, comics in a way, and that's what's kept going. Like any art, it's like it is part of the zeitgeist, but also it's very political. And comics have always been and always will be. They themselves, they're a champion of the oppressed. They're like they speak for the people who need speaking for, and they, again, like any art sought out by any minority group or any group in general, it reflects what people want to see, and it has what people want to see and what they want to get from the world, or what they can't get from the world and need paper to give them.
Sure. Well, before we jump off, Reed, is there anything that you have coming up that you're excited about? Any shows that you have or anything like that? And also, where can we find you streaming, or your team streaming, I should say?
Yeah, you can find us on Whatnot on _comics. We're going to have in the next few days, I'm not sure when, maybe today, if not today, probably Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, we're going to be doing another big 300 bag show. Nice. We're going to have like 5 $400 ceilings, 5 $200, 5 100s, but we're figuring it out. And I'll just say, otherwise, like keep an eye out for Going Twice Comics in the physical world as well. Look for us, and you might find us if you look in the right place.
All right. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Reed, and have a great rest of your day, my friend.
Y'all too.